New York Harbor, January 1943. The night was colder than the Atlantic wind had any right to be. A Liberty ship groaned at the pier, its hull still slick with salt. Floodlights sliced through the fog as American guards waited, rifles slung low, cigarettes burning in the dark. The gangway clanged, and the first German prisoners stepped onto American soil. Their gray wool coats were crusted with sea spray and disbelief. For weeks they had crossed a war-torn ocean in cramped holds, expecting the worst. Punishment, humiliation, maybe revenge. But as they looked around, they saw something else. Electric signs glowing, city windows lit, trains rumbling past without blackout curtains, a skyline untouched by bombs. Even the air smelled of bread, coffee, and oil, not fear. They were enemies, yes, but the land that greeted them felt like another world. Behind them, Europe was burning. Ahead lay America. Vast, unscarred, and almost unreal. In that stunned silence on the docks, one thought pulsed through hundreds of minds. How could the enemy live like this, and still choose to fight? And so began one of the strangest chapters of the Second World War. By early 1943, the tide of the war had begun to turn. In North Africa, Rommel's once celebrated Afrika Korps was collapsing under the combined weight of British and American forces. The desert, once a stage for lightning maneuvers and tank duels, became a graveyard of iron. At Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, the Americans had stumbled, green troops learning hard lessons, but within months, they recovered, reorganized, and pressed forward. By May, the Axis forces in North Africa were cornered against the sea. Nearly 250,000 men, Germans and Italians, laid down their arms. It was one of the largest surrenders in modern history. Now came a problem few had prepared for: where to put them. Britain, already bursting with POWs from earlier campaigns, couldn't absorb more. The Mediterranean bases were too close to the front lines. Africa itself was unstable. But across the Atlantic, America had space, acres of farmland, military bases, and idle construction crews. The United States offered what the Allies needed most: distance and safety. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, prisoner treatment had clear rules. They had to be fed, clothed, and housed at the same standard as the detaining power's own troops. The U.S. took that seriously, both out of obligation and calculation. American officials knew that how they treated German POWs would directly influence the treatment of Allied prisoners in German hands. So the War Department launched Operation Shackle, the massive logistical program to bring captured Axis soldiers across the Atlantic. Between 1942 and 1945, over 370,000 Germans would arrive in the United States. Some came through Boston, others through New Orleans, but most stepped ashore in Hampton Roads, Virginia, or Newport News, fresh from the hold of Liberty ships that only days earlier had carried tanks and supplies eastward. The journey was perilous. Convoys still faced U-boat attacks. POWs were crammed below deck, guarded by American MPs with strict orders but lenient tempers. There were rules: no talking topside, no looking at the horizon, no coded notes. Yet most of the prisoners were exhausted, defeated, and relieved to be alive. When the ships finally reached the American coast, something strange happened. Many of the guards noticed the silence. No jeers, no defiance, just men staring, bewildered at the sight of bright city lights. Germany's night skies had long since gone dark under the weight of Allied bombing. Here, neon burned without fear. The processing centers, temporary enclosures at Camp Shanks in New York or Fort Eustis in Virginia, were efficient and clinical. Photographs, fingerprints, identification numbers. The Germans were issued khaki uniforms with large PW stenciled on the back. Their pay grade depended on rank. Officers refused to work. Enlisted men expected to. After a few days, trains took them inland. Americans watched from station platforms as lines of captured Wehrmacht soldiers rolled through heartland towns. To many civilians, it was surreal. The enemy, right here on American soil. Yet local papers described the scene with curiosity more than hostility. Across cornfields, pine forests, and desert plains, the U.S. began constructing a hidden archipelago of more than 500 camps. They appeared quietly, barbed wire perimeters, guard towers, rows of wooden barracks, often built beside army training grounds or airfields. Their existence was hardly secret but rarely publicized. For many Americans, the war's front had suddenly come home. Inside the War Department, this vast system was a triumph of planning and restraint. To Germany, it would one day become something else entirely, a mirror reflecting their own propaganda's lies. The prisoners were about to discover a land not of vengeance, but of contradictions, kindness laced with caution, abundance surrounded by discipline. That discovery began the moment their train doors opened to the American heartland. By the summer of 1943, the network of German prisoner-of-war camps had spread quietly across the United States, from the pine forests of Alabama to the open plains of Iowa, from the deserts of Arizona to the snowy hills of Wisconsin. More than 500 camps formed what some historians later called America's invisible empire of wire. Each camp followed a near-identical pattern: double fences topped with barbed wire, wooden watchtowers with searchlights, rows of tar paper barracks, and a central compound for roll call and assembly. The architecture was plain but efficient, designed less to punish than to contain. Many of these camps were built adjacent to military bases such as Fort Bliss in Texas or Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. Others stood on converted fairgrounds, abandoned civilian conservation corps sites, or hastily fenced farmland. The War Department had only one rule: prisoners must remain at least 170 miles from any coastline to prevent escape by sea. When the first trains arrived at these inland camps, the local populations often gathered at crossings just to see the enemy. For many Americans, it was a strange sight. Young German men, polite, uniformed, some barely out of their teens. They waved through the train slats. Some smiled. Others stared blankly, still processing defeat. Inside the camps, life settled into rhythm. Each morning began with appel, roll call at dawn. The prisoners ate oatmeal, white bread, and coffee, far more than what German soldiers were used to in the field. The food shocked them. Many would later write home about it. "We eat better here than we did in Tunisia," one soldier noted in a censored letter intercepted by Army intelligence. They could write 2 letters and 4 postcards each month, all inspected by American censors and stamped geprüft. The Red Cross ensured they received packages, cigarettes, chocolate, even musical instruments. There were libraries with German books, orchestras formed from captured musicians, and makeshift churches led by chaplains who had also worn the Iron Cross. The camps were divided by rank. Officers enjoyed more privileges, no labor, better quarters, while enlisted men were sent to work. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be employed in non-war industries. That meant agriculture, forestry, and public works. By 1944, as American men were drafted into Europe and the Pacific, the nation faced a severe labor shortage. The War Manpower Commission saw opportunity. Thousands of POWs were quietly trucked to nearby farms to pick cotton, cut timber, or harvest corn under guard. They were paid 80 cents a day, not in cash, but in canteen tokens they could spend on soap, shaving kits, or extra rations. To farmers, the Germans were an unexpected blessing. To the Germans, the farms were a revelation. For the first time, many saw the vastness of the American countryside. Towns untouched by war, silos full of grain, cars on the roads, children in clean clothes. They were astonished. "We were told Americans were poor and starving under Jewish capitalism," one former POW recalled decades later. But there were no ruins, no hunger. It was a land without fear. That shock deepened when they saw women driving tractors or running stores, a social image that clashed with the rigid gender ideals of the Reich. Another contradiction came from their guards. Some were young Southerners. Others were African-American soldiers from segregated units. For German prisoners raised under Nazi racial ideology, being commanded by a Black American guard was both humiliating and mind-opening. Some reacted with defiance, others, quietly, with reflection. And yet, despite the strict fences, the atmosphere in most camps remained orderly, even civil. Guards and prisoners developed mutual routines. There were occasional fights, rare escapes, and strict punishments for Nazi agitators. But overall, the camps functioned on discipline and a surprising degree of respect. In time, the prisoners adjusted, but they never stopped observing. They compared the abundance of food, the calm of unbombed nights, and the openness of American life with the total war that had consumed Europe. What they saw in those years, comfort amid discipline, freedom within control, would reshape how many of them understood their homeland when they returned. But before that, their perceptions would be tested through a range of experiences, moral, psychological, and deeply human. They would soon learn that captivity in America was not just confinement. It was exposure to a world that defied everything Nazi Germany had told them. Angle A. The human experience. For the German prisoners, captivity in America was an education in contrast. Many had left Europe expecting suffering or vengeance. Instead, they found routine, order, and even kindness. What they could not escape was the strangeness of it all. Being an enemy in a country that did not look or feel like a nation at war. Their first shock was the food. Camp menus were plain but generous. Meat, bread, butter, fruit, coffee, all abundant, even luxurious compared to wartime rations in Germany. It unsettled them. Many whispered to one another that America must have endless supplies, that the Allied blockade had failed, or that the U.S. wasn't suffering at all. Then there was the silence. No air raid sirens, no artillery thunder in the distance. At night they lay awake hearing only crickets, trains, or the faint hum of radio music from the guards' quarters. It was peace, a peace that embarrassed them. Some camps allowed simple recreation, football matches, theater performances, or makeshift orchestras. Others even organized art exhibitions of prisoner-made paintings. One sergeant who had fought in North Africa sketched the view outside the wire, a lone oak tree under a clear sky, and called it "Freedom Seen Through Fences." Many wrote home not about cruelty, but about confusion. They could not reconcile this America, open, fed, unbombed, with the monstrous image the Nazi press had painted. For the first time, propaganda was colliding with personal experience, and that collision would change them more than captivity itself. Angle B. Tactical and logistical reality. Behind the human scenes ran a staggering logistical operation, transporting, feeding, and securing more than 370,000 German POWs across 46 states was one of the largest internment efforts in history. Yet few Americans noticed. The War Department ran the system with military precision. Each camp reported daily to the Provost Marshal General's office in Washington. Supply trains delivered food and medical materials weekly. Guard units rotated every 3 months to prevent familiarity or fraternization. The ratio was strict: 1 armed guard for every 10 prisoners. Fences were tall but not electrified. Floodlights swept the compounds at night. Each camp had a deadline, a few yards inside the inner fence, which no prisoner could cross without warning. But in truth, most never tested it. They had nowhere to run. America was too vast. Escape attempts were rare and almost always futile. The geography alone defeated most plans. Deserts, forests, snowfields, and languages that betrayed them the moment they asked for directions. One German lieutenant who fled a Texas camp made it 50 miles before surrendering himself at a diner, exhausted and hungry. He asked the sheriff for coffee before being sent back, and got it. But beneath the smooth operation was quiet tension. Some camps struggled with overcrowding, others with ideological divides between hardline Nazis and disillusioned soldiers. Occasionally, loyalty patrols, secret prisoner groups, enforced Nazi discipline, threatening or even killing fellow Germans who spoke against the Reich. These incidents were rare but revealing. The war's front lines had merely shifted inward, from battlefield to barrack. Still, the system worked. American efficiency kept rebellion at bay, not through fear, but through predictability. The same clock rang every morning. The same rations arrived each week. The same guards stood their posts. For men used to chaos, that order itself was a form of peace, and a quiet psychological weapon. Angle C, moral and legal dimension. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, housed adequately, and protected from public curiosity. The United States, with its reputation for moral leadership, went to great lengths to uphold those terms, not merely for justice, but for strategy. President Roosevelt's administration and the War Department understood the stakes. Harsh treatment of German POWs could justify Nazi retaliation against captured Americans in Europe, so America's approach was calculated restraint, compassion as policy. Inspections by the International Red Cross were frequent and thorough. Delegates visited camps, questioned prisoners privately, and reported on food, housing, and medical care. When issues arose, poor heating, shortages of blankets, the Army often corrected them. In one report, Red Cross inspectors noted that conditions in Texas camps were comparable to those of American enlisted men in training facilities. Some critics called this leniency excessive. Editorials questioned why enemy soldiers were eating meat and sugar when civilians faced rationing. Congressmen fielded letters from families asking why their sons fought overseas while German soldiers played soccer in Oklahoma. Yet the War Department stood firm. Fair treatment was not mercy, it was propaganda by example. Every well-fed German prisoner was a living message to Axis soldiers still fighting. Surrender is safe. It also became a moral mirror. Many Germans, upon realizing they were being treated with dignity, began to question the Nazi claim that Americans were barbarians under Jewish control. The irony was profound. The Geneva Convention had become a battlefield of ideals. Through discipline, decency, and quiet confidence, the U.S. was waging its own psychological war, one that didn't use bullets but breakfast. For the prisoners, this calm captivity was both bewildering and transformative. But the story of disbelief was only half told. Their deeper shock came not from food or fences, but from encountering America's open mind, its industry, and its contradictions. Angle D, the information. War the barbed wire fences didn't stop the flow of ideas. In nearly every camp, a subtler battle was taking place, not for land or victory, but for the minds of men. The United States believed that the war's true end would come not just through surrender, but through disillusionment. To that end, the War Department and the Office of War Information launched an unprecedented effort, the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division. Its mission was simple but ambitious, to weaken Nazi loyalty through education. Camp libraries were stocked with carefully chosen German books, Goethe, Schiller, Kant, but not Hitler or Rosenberg. Films were screened, documentaries about American life, newsreels of the front, and short features exposing the horrors of Nazi rule. Lectures were given by bilingual American officers and, later, by anti-Nazi German prisoners themselves. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana and Fort Kearny in Rhode Island, select POWs were chosen for re-education programs. They read democratic theory, debated politics, and discussed the war's moral questions. It wasn't brainwashing, it was reintroduction. Many of these men had grown up entirely under Nazi propaganda. Seeing functioning democracy firsthand was, for some, a revelation. The initiative produced mixed results. Some resisted fiercely, calling the re-educated men Verräter, traitors. Others began to question everything they'd believed. "Here, they treat us like humans," one prisoner wrote in a secret note later found by censors. Perhaps that is their greatest weapon. For many, that weapon worked slowly. Seeds of doubt took root, watered by comfort, fairness, and the strange power of an open society. Angle E, the technological and industrial shock. If the re-education programs challenged the prisoners' minds, America's machinery challenged their imaginations. On farms and factories across the Midwest, POWs witnessed production on a scale that defied belief. In Germany by 1944, factories worked under constant bombardment. Assembly lines sputtered, cities burned. In America, industry roared, steady, organized, infinite. At canneries in Arkansas, prisoners watched conveyor belts of fruit moving faster than entire platoons could process by hand. In lumber camps, they saw tractors pulling logs that would have required dozens of men back home. In Texas, rows of harvesters moved across cotton fields like mechanical armies. For engineers among them, it was humbling. For soldiers, demoralizing. The technological advantage of the Allies became visible, tangible, undeniable. They realized the truth. Germany could never outproduce this. Even the smallest details told a story. The packaging of rations, the standardization of tools, the effortless abundance of gasoline. America's industrial miracle was no propaganda film. It was daily reality. The experience rewired many minds. They began to see that the war was not just being lost on the battlefield, but in the factories, the fields, and the supply chains of a nation that seemed inexhaustible. And as they saw that, disbelief turned to respect, even reluctant admiration. The myth of the weak, decadent democracy was gone. Angle F. Seeing the enemy, up close more than anything, what stunned the German prisoners was America itself, its people, its contradictions, and its openness. Outside the wire, they saw things no propaganda had prepared them for. Black and white soldiers serving together, though often unequally. Women managing farms, driving trucks, working in factories. Newspapers criticizing their own government without fear. Churches, shops, baseball games, movie theaters. Life, vivid and loud, continuing as if war were a distant echo. To many Germans, this was incomprehensible. How could a nation at war remain so alive, so unscarred, so free? Some reacted with arrogance, dismissing it as illusion. Others quietly admired it. A few began to envy it. In later interviews, former POWs would recall that they had seen democracy work, not as a theory, but as a landscape. Even the small kindnesses lingered. An Iowa farmer who shared a cigarette, a guard who let a prisoner send an extra letter home, a camp nurse who treated a wounded German with the same care as an American soldier. These moments eroded years of indoctrination more effectively than any speech. But it wasn't all harmony. Many prisoners noticed America's contradictions, segregation, racial slurs, and inequality in plain sight. Some concluded that the U.S. was no utopia after all. Yet even that realization carried weight. Freedom, they understood, included the freedom to criticize and change. By 1945, many German POWs no longer feared America. They respected it, and, more importantly, they began to question the Reich that had sent them to fight it. What began as disbelief was turning into reckoning that the next stage of their story would test that transformation. When captivity collided with collapse, and the war they thought was distant suddenly ended inside their own fences. Arizona, December 1944. The sun hung low over the desert, flattening everything into shades of gold and silence. Beyond the barbed wire of Camp Papago Park near Phoenix, German officers watched the light fade behind the mountains. For months they had been digging, patiently, secretly, with spoons, tin cans, and shovels stolen from work details. Their goal, freedom, or at least the illusion of it. The leader was Captain Jürgen Wattenberg, a decorated U-boat commander and veteran of the Battle of the Atlantic. Captured off the coast of Africa, he had already escaped once, from British custody in South Africa, and intended to do it again on American soil. To him, captivity was dishonor. The desert, endless and unguarded, seemed his best chance. The plan was audacious. Beneath a bathhouse in the officers' compound, they dug a tunnel, 178 feet long, 3 feet deep, propped with scavenged wood from the camp's lumber yard. They disguised the entrance with a drain pipe and carried out soil in their trouser legs, scattering it into gardens and flower beds. For 5 months, no one noticed. American guards were disciplined but complacent. The camp was calm, the prisoners well-behaved. It was Christmas season. The war in Europe seemed nearly won. And yet, on December 23, 1944, as carols played in the recreation hall, 25 German officers vanished into the Arizona night. They crawled out of the sand one by one, their boots crunching on frost-bitten cactus roots. Ahead lay miles of desert, dry canals, and the distant lights of Phoenix. They split into groups, some heading south toward Mexico, others east toward the mountains. Wattenberg carried a crude compass and a map torn from a National Geographic. For a few hours they felt the taste of freedom. Then reality struck. The desert was vast, cold, and indifferent. Most had no food, no real supplies, and no knowledge of the terrain. Their uniforms, dyed brown for camouflage, stood out against pale sand. Within a day, the first group surrendered to a startled gas station attendant. Others stumbled into towns asking for water in broken English. One duo tried to build a raft from stolen lumber to float down the Salt River toward Mexico. They hadn't realized the river was dry. Their boat ran aground in sand before they made it a mile. Within 2 weeks, every escapee was recaptured. None were killed, none resisted. Wattenberg himself hid for over a month in the city of Phoenix, sleeping in abandoned houses and surviving on scavenged food. When he was finally caught, he saluted the American officer who arrested him. The Papago escape, as it became known, was the largest POW breakout on U.S. soil during the war. Newspapers covered it with restrained amusement. Headlines read, "25 Nazis dig out, all recaptured, safe and unharmed." The public's reaction was oddly casual. The war was going well. American confidence was unshaken. But for the War Department, the escape was a revelation. It showed both the limits and the success of America's POW policy. Despite opportunities, the Germans had not turned violent. They sought freedom, not revenge. When captured, they were treated fairly. And they knew it. Wattenberg later admitted as much in his interrogation. "You were good captors," he said. "Too good, perhaps. It made us restless." For many prisoners who remained behind, the escape became camp legend, a brief flicker of defiance in a life defined by monotony. But even that event carried no bitterness. The escapees returned to clean barracks, warm food, and guards who laughed at the futility of it all. Something deeper was changing. The war was shifting irrevocably in Europe. In the camps, radios crackled with the news. Allied landings in France, Soviet advances in the East. The Third Reich was shrinking by the week. By the time the last Papago escapee walked back through the gate in handcuffs, the men inside knew the truth. Their homeland was falling. And America, this strange, abundant, bewildering nation, would be the stage upon which they would hear its final collapse. The calm before that revelation would not last long. Within months, the world they once fought for would cease to exist. And inside the barbed wire, that moment of reckoning would arrive not with gunfire, but with a radio broadcast. Spring 1945. The radio in the Camp Algona Recreation Hall crackled with static before the voice came through. Faint, broken, then unmistakable. "Berlin has fallen." The words echoed through the room like a cannon that no one could see. Dozens of prisoners froze mid-motion, cards half played, cigarettes half raised. The announcer's tone was calm, but the meaning tore through them like shrapnel. The Reich, their Reich, was gone. Outside, April winds swept through the barbed wire fences. The guards didn't celebrate. They watched quietly as hundreds of German soldiers, officers, clerks, engineers, farmers, sat in stunned silence. Many had long suspected the end was near, but hearing it spoken in the cold official voice of an American broadcast was something else entirely. Days later, another transmission arrived. Adolf Hitler was dead. Some cheered, cautiously, privately. Others wept. A few refused to believe it, calling it Allied propaganda. But in the faces of most men, something collapsed. Their cause, their purpose, their certainty, all gone overnight. In Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, and Camp McCain, Mississippi, tension rippled like electricity. For months, ideological divides had simmered between hardline Nazis and ordinary soldiers. The true believers clung to rumors that Hitler had escaped, that new secret weapons would reverse the war, that surrender was a lie. But for the majority, the illusion had died. Fights broke out in mess halls. At Tonkawa, a young anti-Nazi prisoner named Johannes Kunze was murdered by fellow Germans for criticizing Hitler. The crime shocked the camp and the War Department. For the first time, Americans saw the internal war raging within their captives. The military cracked down. Leaders of Nazi cells were isolated in separate compounds. The propaganda leaflets and swastika badges, long hidden in lockers and footlockers, were confiscated. The mood shifted from defiance to disbelief, and then, slowly, to reflection. Meanwhile, the world outside the fences changed with terrifying speed. Germany lay in ruins. Allied photographs and Red Cross reports circulated in camp newspapers. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg were flattened. The prisoners studied the images with quiet horror. Their homes, their families, might be among the rubble. At Camp Swift in Texas, a group of POWs gathered around a single newspaper clipping showing the liberation of Buchenwald. The photograph of emaciated survivors left them speechless. Many refused to believe it. "It must be staged," one whispered. But others stared for long minutes and said nothing. The silence in that moment was heavier than any confession. Then came May 8, 1945, VE Day. In the camps, there were no parades, no songs, just the sound of flags being lowered. The guards observed a moment of silence for the war dead, friend and foe alike. In many compounds, German prisoners requested their own service. Some prayed quietly. Others stood rigidly, eyes forward, unsure whether to mourn or to breathe again. With the war over, everything changed inside the fences. The hierarchy that had defined the camps, officers commanding enlisted men, Nazis enforcing discipline, began to crumble. Prisoners who had once shouted orders now sat quietly, their authority meaningless. The power of ideology had evaporated in the desert wind. The Americans noticed the difference. Requests for reading material increased. Prisoners volunteered for re-education lectures they once mocked. In camp classrooms, German men read the Federalist Papers, discussed democracy, and debated war guilt. It was as if the end of the Reich had cleared a fog from their minds. One report from the Special Projects Division noted, "The collapse of Germany has transformed the prisoners more effectively than any lesson plan. They are now students of reality." But amid that intellectual awakening, there was grief, deep and private. Letters arrived bearing black-edged borders. Fathers missing in the east, mothers killed in air raids, cities gone. The men who had entered captivity as proud soldiers now saw themselves as exiles from a country that no longer existed. The paradox was painful. They were enemies no longer, yet they could not go home. In Camp Shelby, Mississippi, a guard later recalled seeing a German officer standing at the fence at dusk, staring west. He asked what the man was looking for. The prisoner replied softly, "For a country that isn't there anymore." By the summer of 1945, the camps had changed from military prisons into holding grounds for lost men. Men learning to reconcile who they were with what they had seen. They had come to America as conquerors in defeat, but now they stood as witnesses to something far greater, the survival of a system that had beaten them not through cruelty, but through stability, reason, and endurance. The war was over, yet for the German prisoners, the reckoning was just beginning. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the question that lingered across America's prisoner of war network was simple. What now? By mid-1945, the war in Europe was over, but the machinery that had built and maintained more than 500 POW camps could not simply vanish overnight. There were still more than 370,000 German prisoners inside the United States, scattered from Maine to California. They had fought for a nation that no longer existed, saluted a flag that had burned in Berlin, and now waited for instructions that would never come. The U.S. government faced a complex puzzle: how to return them, where to send them, and in what order. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to be repatriated as soon as hostilities ceased. But in the chaos of 1945, Europe was not ready to receive them. Ports were bombed out. Rail lines were shattered. Germany was divided into zones of occupation with no functioning civil authority. For many, going home would have to wait. And so, the camps remained. Quieter now, but still alive. The War Department began organizing the repatriation program, a massive logistical effort to return hundreds of thousands of Axis POWs to Europe. The first to go were the wounded, the sick, and the non-combatants. Others were reassigned, shipped temporarily to Britain and France, which desperately needed labor to rebuild cities and harvest crops. Some Germans spent months, even years, digging trenches, repairing railroads, and working in coal mines under Allied supervision before they finally saw home again. Inside the American camps, the months after victory were marked by an odd peace, a kind of waiting that felt endless. Guards relaxed their vigilance. The fences seemed less like prisons and more like boundaries of routine. Prisoners tended gardens, painted murals, wrote music, and staged plays. Christmas of 1945 saw carols sung in both German and English. Yet beneath that calm were shadows. At Camp Tonkawa, where the earlier murder of Johannes Kunze had taken place, an American military tribunal sentenced 5 German prisoners to death. They were hanged on July 10, 1945, the only executions of POWs in the United States during the war. The case sent a clear signal. The discipline of war might have ended, but justice had not. In contrast, at Camp Algona in Iowa, the spirit was entirely different. There, German artisans and carpenters, granted limited freedom and tools, built something extraordinary. A handcrafted nativity scene, carved from plaster and wood, painted in vivid color. It was completed for Christmas 1945. 65 life-size figures representing the birth of Christ, created by men who months earlier had fought under the Iron Cross. The display drew thousands of local visitors. When the prisoners were finally released, the town kept the nativity as a gift. It still stands today, a silent monument to humanity amid war. By 1946, the Great Exodus began. Trains carried the Germans to East Coast ports, mostly Newport News, Virginia, and New York Harbor, where ships waited under gray skies. As each transport departed, bands played, and guards shook hands with prisoners who had become, over time, something closer to neighbors. For many Americans, it was a strange farewell. The enemy who had once symbolized tyranny now looked like young men grateful to leave, and perhaps changed by what they had seen. The statistics tell one part of the story. Fewer than 1% of all German POWs in the United States died in captivity. Most deaths were from illness or accidents, not violence. In a war defined by mass death, that number was astonishing. It reflected a system that, despite its scale, had remained remarkably humane. When the last camps began to close in late 1946, their empty barracks stood like ghosts across the landscape, reminders of a time when the world's deadliest war had briefly crossed into the quiet heart of America. But the true aftermath would unfold not in the United States, but across the Atlantic. When the prisoners finally returned to a homeland they scarcely recognized. When the German prisoners finally stepped off the ships in Europe, they were not the same men who had boarded them years earlier. The war was gone, the uniforms faded, and the world they returned to was something unrecognizable. The Germany of 1946 was a wasteland. Cities that once glittered, Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, were now flattened plains of concrete dust and twisted steel. Families had vanished or been scattered across the divided occupation zones. Some prisoners arrived home to discover that their towns no longer existed on any map. For many returning POWs, America became a haunting memory, a parallel world that existed in color while theirs was trapped in gray. They spoke quietly of it. The meals, the fairness, the calm, the endless stores of food. It was a story almost too strange to believe in a starving land. Yet that memory carried power. In both West and East Germany, these returnees became unintentional messengers of democracy. They had seen it up close, not as propaganda, but as lived reality. Some of them began speaking to schools and youth groups about the America behind the fences. Others joined new civic organizations, universities, or journalism. From this post-war intellectual ferment came something remarkable. A German newspaper founded by former POWs called Der Ruf, The Call. Its editors, Hans Werner Richter and Alfred Andersch, had both been prisoners in the United States and products of the reeducation program. Their mission was to guide Germany toward democratic renewal, to prove that learning from defeat did not mean surrendering identity. Der Ruf would later inspire the influential literary movement known as Group 47, which helped shape West German thought for decades. But not all memories were simple. Many returning soldiers faced suspicion from their own people. To some, those who had been treated well in America seemed tainted, softened, Americanized. Others, returning from Soviet captivity where millions had perished, looked on the U.S. returnees with disbelief or envy. The contrast was staggering. In American camps, survival was nearly certain. In Soviet ones, it was a gamble against death. The American treatment of POWs had not only preserved lives, it had seeded comparisons that Germany could not ignore. The moral and material difference between occupiers became one of the earliest lessons of the Cold War. Still, the prisoners' admiration for America was not blind. They remembered its contradictions. Racial segregation, lynchings reported in American newspapers, the irony of democracy limited by color lines. "They treated us better than some of their own citizens," one former POW later said, a line that would appear in several post-war interviews and documentaries. For many, this paradox became proof of something deeper, that freedom was not perfection, but struggle. And that struggle was precisely what made it real. Over the next decades, historians would note an invisible thread linking these experiences to the new German mindset of the 1950s, pragmatic, restrained, and wary of ideology. The POWs who had seen America's calm efficiency and civic order became quiet advocates for moderation at home. In countless interviews years later, they described their time in the U.S. not as imprisonment, but as a school without classrooms. One of them wrote in his memoir, "We lost the war in Africa, but we found ourselves in America. They won with tanks, yes, but also with humanity." That was perhaps the most enduring victory of all. One fought not on beaches or battlefields, but across kitchen tables, libraries, and quiet fields under the American sun. By the time the last German prisoners were released in 1946 and 1947, they left behind more than empty camps. They left a legacy of transformation, one born from disbelief, tested by defeat, and remembered with a strange gratitude. They had come to America as enemies. They returned to Germany as witnesses. The first time they saw America, the German prisoners thought they were seeing an illusion. Bright lights in wartime, abundance without fear, freedom without chaos. Years later, many of them would still remember that first shock more vividly than the battles that came before. Their disbelief had not been born of admiration alone. It came from contrast, between a world built on obedience and another sustained by confidence. In Germany, loyalty was demanded through fear. In America, it was assumed through trust. And in that quiet distinction lay the heart of the lesson that thousands of POWs carried home. The war had taught them the limits of violence. Captivity taught them the strength of decency. America's greatest weapon had not been the B-17 or the Sherman tank. It was the unshaken normalcy of its people. The sight of a guard sharing coffee, a farmer lending a book, or a child unafraid of soldiers spoke louder than any political lecture. In the years that followed, historians would call this the moral victory of the West. But to the men who lived it, it was simpler. They had arrived expecting revenge and found responsibility. They had expected hatred and found rules, fairness, and sometimes even kindness. When they returned to a ruined homeland, they brought back more than memories. They brought perspective. They had seen a democracy that functioned under pressure, a society that could fight total war without losing its soul. and in that sense, their captivity was never truly imprisonment. It was revelation. The ships that once carried them as prisoners later carried them home as witnesses. Men who had looked across an ocean and glimpsed what the future could be if humanity chose reason over rage. Standing at the rail of those homebound transports, watching America disappear into the mist, many realized the truth they could not have imagined when they first stepped onto its shores. That sometimes the greatest defeat is to be conquered by another's humanity. This was one story among thousands. Of men, of choices, of nations reshaped. Join us as we uncover more rare, factual accounts from World War II's hidden corners. Subscribe now.